Hi, and welcome to our next lesson, preparing for the GED Social Studies exam. Our topic for today is the economy of the 1800s, looking at the Industrial Revolution, agriculture, and the slave trade. And I know what you're thinking. 18th century economy? You're thinking, that sounds incredibly boring. And you know what? Maybe you're correct a little bit, maybe a little. But I think it's a very fascinating period. And I think you will find some really interesting things too. So let's go. Economy of the 1800s, Industrial Revolution, agriculture, and the slave trade. So first, we're really going to start talking about the Industrial Revolution. And like looking behind me, this is an exciting time in American history where we see workers going to work and getting jobs in American history. We see these huge factories, these huge industry where we have this middle class going, working their shift, making wages, coming home, and then taking their money that they're getting from wages and spending on things, creating this economy. They're renting homes in the cities, they're renting apartments, they're buying clothing and goods and spending their money on entertainment for the first time in American history. So let's take a look at this. So this time period, again, stretching from 1760 to 1840, we see these huge companies and factories being built. These are images of textile mills where they're actually making fabrics at a mass rate so then people can reproduce clothing at a mass rate. And the faster and quicker you can make the same thing over and over again, the cheaper you can sell it on the market. So the workers can take their wages that they're making and buy and purchase these new items, these fashionable outfits that we'll take a look at. So again, big factories, big companies, we see the development of technology, this steam engine that's able to then bring materials in for them to make the products and then also transport the products out so the local community can be purchasing and buying them. I just noticed something in this picture. I think that's a British flag. This actually might be a factory in England, not America. So, note, key detail. That's the British flag. All right, textiles. Textiles are fabrics. We're seeing them spooling, making yarn, making fabrics, again, that can go into clothing, can go into curtains, can go into couches and pillowcases. A lot of fabric is being made at this time period in these large factories. We're seeing huge sheets of fabric and designs and patterns, which then starts to relate into fashion, that you can be very selective on the outfits that you're wearing and have different patterns and different designs for different occasions. And they're mass producing it, which means now that it's not just the rich of the rich who can afford it. We're seeing that middle class getting access to a lot of these items. Technologies, steam engines, transportation, which allows you to travel faster and further distances, but it also allows you to bring in your supply, bring in your materials that you're turning into your product, and allows you to transport your product to other places. We also see steam engines and boats, which is huge because it allows people to travel up the rivers faster, to travel to these port cities, to take your products and to sell them into other places. This also affects the immigration between Europe and this new country, the United States. You're able to travel to Europe faster, bring over these new items, these new fashion, these new products of Europe, bring them to the Americas and sell them in your businesses as well. We see iron making, which is huge for building industry. We're seeing bigger buildings, bigger bridges, better roads, all through this development of iron and making iron, and really making the United States this infrastructure that it needs. Bigger buildings, bigger cities, better roads, better bridges for this really quick developing country. Also, something that's really fascinating in this time period is this idea of tools. And we I think in modern society, take this for advantage. We take this for granted because we have access to tools and we have tools that are at home. But imagine for the first time getting these larger machine tools and being able to have them at your home allows you now to start your own business. It also allows you to become a specialist, to become a carpenter, to become an electrical engineer, to come, to make these specialized trades and jobs that are very new and popular, which now allows you to create your own business, to make more money, and really kind of elevate yourself and your family in society at this time. And starting this concept of the American dream of the harder you work, the more money you make, and you're able to then elevate yourself in society economically. And it's all about this concept of making money. Everything is about making money. You work to make money, you take that money and you spend it on things. So it's like companies are buying and selling their products and making money. The companies are making money. But also they're buying and selling their products to other countries and making money too. So this idea of this international market, but most importantly, this idea of workers, that they're paying their workers money so their workers can go and buy products, giving back to this cycle. And we're going to see how this idea of an economy is a flow of money. It is this cycle of buying and selling products, paying wages to your workers who then are participating in the buying and selling of this market. All of these blue collar workers that we're seeing. So let's take a look. So we have this industry, we have this factory that's making all of these beautiful, fashionable products that the middle class for the first time can now afford. Not just the rich of the rich, but everybody can afford them because they're pumping them out really quickly, really fast, that people can afford them. We have all of these workers, these middle class workers that are getting all of this money from their wages. So the factory is paying money for these workers. These workers then are taking their money and participating in the economy locally. They're paying rent, they're buying food, they're buying clothing, they're going to the theater. They are participating in this economy, spending their money on these things. And the products that they buy, that profit and money goes now back to the factories that are creating them. So it is this constant flow, and this is the creation of an economy, this flow of money. Now let's look at agriculture. Agriculture is now really popular in the United States in this time period too, especially in the South. The South have these really huge farms that they call plantations. And here's some images of some plantations. These massive farms where they were mass producing a type of crop or a product that they were selling for money. And here's an image of a plantation in the South of the United States with those beautiful pillars. So what they're making for money is they're selling cotton. They have all this cotton that they're then selling to the factories to, again, make those fabrics and those textiles. They're growing tobacco, which was a huge cash crop at that time. It's a very addictive substance. And they were then selling that, leaving the Americas and going to Europe and producing and selling tobacco to the Europeans. And another one they were selling was a flower called indigo. And you're thinking, what? A flower? What could they use a flower for? Think about it. Well, let me show you what they were using that flower for. So we have this farm, and they're taking their cotton and their indigo, and they're selling it to the industry. And the industries are now taking the cotton and they're taking the flower, and they're using the flower as a dye to dye the cotton and turn it into blue jeans. And we're seeing blue jeans happening. And the first blue jeans, I don't remember the date, but it was, when was the first blue jeans? 1871, there was. 1871 was the first pair of blue jeans, and we're starting to see hit the market. So we see this flow of money. The agriculture, the farms is selling the cotton and the indigo to the industry, making all of that money. The industry then is then using it to produce these blue jeans. selling those blue jeans, making all of the money, but it makes the cycle because the farmers are often the ones buying the blue jeans, helping them do their jobs better and more effectively. And so the farmers make the cotton, the industry turns it into blue jeans, and then the farmers and the workers are buying the blue jeans from the factories. So it is this cycle, this flow of money called an economy, and how they're interconnected with each other. Now let's looking at a bigger scale from a world, kind of a world economy. A big one in this time period is the slave trade. Now we're in the 1800s right now, it's kind of towards the end of it, but something to note is that the slave trade had been going on for hundreds of years, and not just hundreds of years. Slavery had existed for thousands of years before that, and it exists even after this time period. Slavery even exists today in some parts of the world. It is this concept that has been going on. But looking at the 1800s, slavery and the slave trade was very vital in this world economy at this time. Let's look at some pictures. So up here in Europe, we have these European explorers on their boats traveling the world, creating this world economy of selling and buying products. So the Europeans, they have firearms that they've developed. They have gunpowder from China. They have these fashionable European clothing. They have alcohol, whiskey, wine that they've been fermenting. And they're taking those products and they're selling them down into Africa. Their first stop is Africa. They're going down here, selling a lot of those products. In Africa, they're finding items like ivory to make jewelry. They're finding gold and value. They're finding spices, exotic spices for cooking. And their big product that they're fighting is this manual labor, this slave labor, these slaves that they're buying. And in many cases, some of them were bought, that we're seeing some African tribes enslaving other African tribes and selling them to the Europeans as slaves. This is kind of a misconception. Some people don't realize that just because you have an entire continent of people that are all black colored skin, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of the tribes got along. They had some tribes that were actually warring tribes against other tribes, and some of the tribes did not get along. And we see some African tribes invading tribes and actually enslaving a lot of those people. That is happening in Africa at this time. But in some cases too, the Europeans actually would just come into remote villages and actually just take the people too and capture their own slaves. We see a little bit of both of that happening. So now, the first stop was in Africa. Now they're shooting across the Atlantic Ocean into South America, into the Caribbean. And in the Caribbean, they're finding tobacco that the Americans were making and growing. They're seeing all these textiles and fabrics that these American companies and industries are making. They're seeing cotton and indigo. They're finding sugarcane from the Caribbean, and then they are then sending it back to Europe. And so it is this constant trade of goods. But something to keep in mind is how interconnected they are. The Europeans need the sugar cane to come over to Europe for them to ferment and to make these alcohols, to make rum. They then take that fermented alcohol and send it back down and now sell it back to the people where they got the sugar cane from. They're taking that alcohol and those firearms, selling them to Africa, getting slaves to send over to Caribbean, and the more slaves they take over, the more sugar cane that can be harvested. And the more sugar cane that can be harvested, the more alcohol they can produce. And the more alcohol they can produce, the more slaves they can get. And you see how this concept is now interconnected, that they're buying and selling these products, changing them, and then selling them back to the people. It is the same concept of cotton and indigo being turned into blue jeans, and then that product being sold back to the farmers, this new thing that they created being sold back. The only difference is we see this at a large global scale, traveling across. Now, another thing to keep in mind, there is a reason why the flow is clockwise in this direction. And a lot of it has to do with, not a lot of it, all of it has to do with the currents of the Atlantic Ocean. The currents, or the way the Atlantic Ocean moves, because of the heating and cooling of the water, the heating next to the equator and the cooling up in the north, it creates this convection, or this natural flow, that the water is moving in this clockwise directions. It was very, very difficult at that time to go from England straight over to North America. It was easier to follow the coastline, to ride that current, and then to shoot over to South America, and then ride the current back up, and to ride that current back over to Europe. So they made this natural clockwise flow of trade. And that money gets flowed back in the other direction. All of this money goes into Europe. All of these resources is getting sold to the people coming from Africa, and then that money is going back to the Americans. And it's all about the flow of money, making money, becoming rich. And something to note is that one of the large products that was sold was actually people, Black people, these enslaved Africans. And at this time period, especially in North America, they viewed them as an item, as an object, as property that you could own. And that mindset really starts to change in the 18th century because of the introduction of industry. We're starting to see people in the US society question that, saying, we believe in a country where all men are created equal. Does that include the color of your skin? And you start seeing people question that yes, no matter the color of your skin, you're still a human, and we believe in this thing called human rights. And we're seeing people fight for that in this time period. So, making money. We see this flow of money coming in. Now let's talk about the connection of slavery. When I have these two fields, agriculture and industry, agriculture is most likely to support the concept of slavery. They need the manual labor. They need these slaves, and they can't really afford to pay them to work in the fields to collect the cotton, because again, they don't have a lot of technology, and they're going through and they're collecting all of this cotton by hand. It's very tedious, very strenuous. You need a very large manual labor force to work the agriculture. Now, industry does not necessarily support slave labor. Industry really believes in the idea of paying wages to your workers. And why is that? Because those workers need to leave and participate in the economy. An industry wouldn't be successful if there wasn't a large population of workers buying their products. They need to be giving to that economy, having all of their workers work for wages, leave the factory, and then spend their money in the economy, so that money, by buying their products, can then flow back to the factory and create this cycle called an economy. And that economy only works if your workers are getting paid wages, getting paid money. And so everyone working in these new industries, these new factories in the North, really start realizing, no, we can pay our workers. This concept of slave labor is ridiculous. You need to pay your workers. Your workers need to make money so they can then go and buy and sell products and participate in the economy. And in the agricultural field, they really support the slave labor, saying, no, we can't really afford to pay them. We need this large population of free manual labor. And we start seeing this conflict. And this ideal, this ideology really starts separating the country from the North and the South. And that conflict creates a war that we call the Civil War. And we will look at that at a different class. We start seeing this division, this conflict. Cause and effect. Here's our first passage. During the era of the American Revolution, northern and southern states were united behind the common goal of gaining independence from Britain. However, as time went by, differences between the two regions grew pronounced. With the beginning of the 1800s, the South remained primarily agricultural, received those farms. The Southern economy centered on plantations and the use of enslaved African laborers. The northern economy, on the other hand, featured growing commercial and industrial sectors in addition to agriculture. These differences caused economic and ideological friction between the North and the South. Disputes over the states' rights emerged as questions arose about the morality and legality of slavery in the United States territories. Let's take a look at our first question. Which is one of the effects of the regional differences that emerged between the North and the South in the mid-1800s? A. Northern states strongly supported states' rights. B. The South began using labor of enforced people. The Northern economy became increasingly diverse. Northern farmers began establishing plantations. Well, first, let's remove some answers that just are not correct. D sticks out automatically because I know plantations were not in the North. The large plantations were in the South, so D cannot be our correct answer. Now we have A, northern states strongly supported states' rights. That really was not mentioned here. I mean, I guess it says the North and the South disputes over states' rights emerged as questions arose about the morality and legality of slavery, but it doesn't really tell you if the North or the South, which one supported states' rights and which one's not. I'm going to remove A. I think B and C are kind of our best options. We have C, the northern economy became increasingly diverse, or B, the southern states began using slave labor. And so we have to decide which one really caused these regional differences here in the mid-1800s. Was it began using slave labor or northern economy becoming increasingly diverse? If you selected C, you are correct. And the reason is because of the word began, we know that slavery did not begin in the 1800s. They had been using slavery for hundreds of years. Even before the United States became the United States, there were enslaved Africans in that territory, in the 13 colonies in the UK and England. And so the big change that we see in the United States right now is the part that the North is becoming increasingly diverse, mainly with factories and industries, like you see behind me, and that these workers are getting paid wages. And that change in the economy really affected that ideology of, oh, if we pay workers, those workers leave and they spend their money, and that money flow starts to create an economy, and it eventually comes back to the factories. So the factories can get bigger and better and make more things, make more products, so that these middle-class workers that have these wages and have these money can save up to and to buy our things and have that money flow back to us to create that economy. And that idea, this change of economy, really affected the idea of, that really changed the North and the South in the mid-1800s. So for our next question, we're going to look at regional differences. Here's my graph. So I have my region, New England, Middle Colonies, Southern Colonies. We're now gone back in time just a little bit, looking at colonial America. I see the economy: agriculture, fishing, shipping, lumber, trade, agriculture, trade, small industries, agriculture. Settlement patterns: I see towns, small farms, some large cities, large plantations, and small farms. Let's read our first paragraph. While the original 13 colonies were united under British rule, each colonial region developed a different way of life. In New England, most colonists lived in towns. Some colonists in the region farmed, and others worked in industries such as fishing, shipping, lumber, and trade. In the Middle Colonies, most people lived and worked on small farms. However, there were also large cities such as Philadelphia and New York in the region. Trade and some small industries were also important. The Southern Colonies featured many large plantations. Agriculture was the dominant economic activity in the region. All right. B, based on the table and the passage, which economic activity occurred in each region? So what economic activity occurred in each region? If you said agriculture, you are correct. We have A, agriculture. We see it in all three. 15. The second column of the table contains information about which topic? We need to know the word column. And the question is, do columns go up and down or do they go sideways? And the answer is up and down. Columns go up and down like the columns of a building, where rows go sideways. So we want our second column. So I have our first and our second column. What is the topic for our second column? If you said economy, you are correct. We have economic activities of each region. Let's see. Next question, number 16. In which colony might people be more quickly informed about news and events? This is where the GED is expecting you to think critically about this information. One, we need to know where these places are located and which regions they're in. So we have Maryland, South Carolina, Massachusetts, and Georgia. And you have to decide which one of these three regions are those areas. Maryland, South Carolina, Massachusetts, and Georgia. Well, Maryland, South Carolina, and Georgia. Well, Georgia and South Carolina are in the southern colonies down here. So we have South Carolina and we have Georgia in the southern colonies. Maryland is right around where Washington, D.C. is, below New York, and that is in the middle colonies. And Massachusetts is over, like Boston is in Massachusetts, and that is our New England territory. So we have South Carolina and Georgia, we have Maryland, and we have Massachusetts. We have to think which one of these, our question, let's read our question one more time. Which colony might people be more quickly informed about news and events? So I see towns, small farms, some large cities, large plantations and farms. Where would people be more connected and can get news and information quicker? If you said towns, you are correct. Towns is where people can get more information, more newspapers, access information a lot quicker. And so our answer is C, Massachusetts. Number 17. What information could you learn from the passage that you could not find in the table? The number of people living in each colony or region, specific examples of large cities in the middle colonies, types of plantations found in the southern colonies, the industry in which New England colonists worked. So here's my graph. And here was my reading. Are there any answers that we can eliminate? I can eliminate 2 answers already. I know for sure that none of this information talked about the amount of people. There was nothing in the reading or the number that talked about this is the amount of people who live here. Also, in the South, it didn't tell us anything about types of plantations. It just said plantations in the reading or in the graph. So that leaves me B, specific examples of large cities, or the industries in which New England colonists worked. And looking at my question again, what information could you learn from the passage, from the reading, that you could not learn from the table? So I'm looking for more information in the reading that is not in the table. So it's not going to be in the table. Is B in the table? Specific examples of large cities in the middle colonies? No. Is D in the table? The industries in which New England colonists worked? Yes, it said they worked in lumber, they worked in fishing, they worked in all those industries. So I know D can't be right because that's on my graph. Does the reading have specific examples of large cities in the middle colonies? Let's look at our reading again. So there's no cities here in our middle colonies. If I go to our section of our middle colonies, in the middle colonies, most people lived and worked on small farms. However, there were also large cities such as Philadelphia and New York. There are my examples. So I know the correct answer is B. 18. The economic patterns established in the colonial era related directly to which future historical event. And this is a hard question if we don't really understand what's going on in this time period. The idea of industries and the idea of agriculture and the idea of industry saying, no, we need workers who are making money so they can spend their money and participate in the economy. And we have agriculture going, we can't really afford to pay all of these farmers to do this really tedious work. We need a large manual workforce that is not paid, called slaves. And we see this conflict, this ideological conflict, which leads to a war, this separation of the United States into two parts. And that war is called B, the Civil War. French and Indian War is before the United States becomes the United States. The American Revolution is before the 1800s, which is right when the United States is created. The Great Depression actually happens. We'll talk about that in a later class. That happens in the 1930s. My grandparents lived during the Great Depression in the 1930s. So this is more modern history. So the Civil War is the only thing that happens in the 1800s. Okay. And 19. Which of the following assumptions can you logically make about the reasons for the differences among the colonies? What could we make? A, geography and climate played a large part in the differences among the colonies. B, temperate New England climate fostered the growth of large plantations. C, because the southern colonies were further south, their climate and geography encouraged industry. And D, the large forest and rocky lands of the middle colonies encouraged fur trapping and the lumber industry. Let me eliminate answers that I know are not correct. First, I see New England, which is in the north, and I see the word plantation, so I know that can't be correct. Plantations were not in New England, they were in the south. Same thing here, I see southern colonies, and I see industry. I know that can't be correct because my industries were not in the south. My industries were up north in Boston, Philadelphia, and those northern areas up in the north. So now that leaves me with A, and it leaves me with D. Which one could be a better answer? Geography and climate played a large part in the differences among the colonies, or the large forest and rocky lands of the middle colonies encouraged fur trapping in the lumber industry. The answer is, let me change the color here, A. And the reason why I know it is A is because in the middle colonies, if we look at our graph, was there fur trapping in the lumber industry? Let's take a look. In our graph, it will show us that the fur trapping and the lumber industry was happening in the northern colonies. It was not happening in the middle colonies. So I know that answer is not correct. So correct answer is A. All right, now let's look at states. So here's my next chart. I have Northwest Territory states. I have all these states, the years that they became states, and the cardinal order of what they became when they became states. Let's read. When Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance in July of 1787, the Northwest Territory was created. The new territory was a sizable area of federal land east of the Mississippi River, between the Great Lakes and the Ohio River. At the same time, Congress established a form of government for the Northwest Territory and declared how various areas of land might eventually become states. The Northwest Ordinance required the creation of at least 3, but not more than 5 states from the Northwest Territory, and the boundaries of each new state were defined. The ordinance prohibited slavery and required each new state to number at least 60,000 inhabitants to qualify for statehood. So which state could be placed in the category of a state formed after 1840? Let's look at my chart. So I'm looking for after 1840. Which state would that be? That would be the state of D, Wisconsin. Good job. 16. The information presented in the table and the passage categorizes states created from the Northwest Territory. How could this group of states be categorized? Free states, states west of the Mississippi, states south of the Ohio River, or slave states. Let me eliminate answers that I know are not right. 1, west of the Mississippi is not right. I know they said they are east of the Mississippi River, right under the Great Lakes. South of the Ohio River is wrong. They're technically north of the Ohio River. So I have to choose, were they considered free states or were they considered slave states? I remember in the passage, they specifically said Congress said they had to prohibit slavery. So my correct answer is A, free states, because they were required to prohibit slavery. Excellent job. And that ends today's lesson on the economy of the 1800s, looking at the Industrial Revolution, agriculture, and the slave trade. I will see you next time for our next class.